You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio. Welcome to the Bitter Medicine Podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. Our show focuses on Black news and entertainment, arts, science, economics, history, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans within the diaspora. And now, your host, whose favorite color is black, Goku.
Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Koku. Today's show, before we get into today's show, let me give the customary free biz shout out. Free business shout out goes to Stephanie Renee's Salon, located at 1614 West Main Street in Kalamazoo, Michigan. The zip code there is 49006. You can reach Stephanie Renee's Salon at 269-459-6535. That's 269-459-6535. They're conveniently located inside Cali Beauty. Next up is amymarie.maven.com. That's AMYMARIE.MAYVENN.com. They also deal in natural hair care products. Their mission is to provide high-quality products with unparalleled shopping experience, world-class technology and hair care products, etc. You can find them at amymarie.maven.com. Next up is Melanated Conscious Society. You heard me talking to Kepra L on my podcast several weeks back. You could find them at www.melanatedconscioussociety.com. melanatedconscioussociety.com is a mentor Black community empowerment organization in Jacksonville, Florida. Make sure to follow them on all social media platforms. And if you have a skill or talent related to marketing, like social media marketing or graphics or whatever you can do, or reach out to them and offer your assistance. It's for a good cause. It's organizing for our people. Lastly, Glennae Davis on Twitter. She could be reached at GLENNAERN@gmail.com. I'll just read what she sent me. She said, "Hello, thanks for your reply. I'm Glennae Davis, an LA-based registered nurse, author of a critically acclaimed memoir, Yet Here I Stand, creator and chief nurse of Nave's Vision, a healthcare media empire where we provide the healthcare education and planning to bridge the gaps of knowledge between discriminated, disadvantaged people facing employment discrimination and the healthcare industry, resulting in having a strategic plan with the medical support they need to no longer be victimized, merchandised, or marginalized by the system." I currently have 2 products available for your listeners. Number 1 is the memoir, and number 2, a free health checklist. So guys, if you're listening, make sure reach out to Glennae Davis. Once again, her email address is GLENNAERN@gmail.com. Today we're going to do the book review of the Bitter Medicine Book Club July reading, which was How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney. Joining me is going to be the Bitter Medicine Book Club moderator, Mr. Karl Hezekiah. Karl Hezekiah, are you on the line?
I'm here, sir. How are you?
I'm good, man. Nice to talk to you again. Let's just get right into it, shall we?
All right.
All right. So, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa is a book written by Walter Rodney. And it basically takes the view that Africa was deliberately exploited and underdeveloped by the European powers, right?
Right.
Karl, let's go through this kind of, I guess, somewhat chapter by chapter, right? Because there's about 6 chapters in this book. And First, let me just say once again, thank you for selecting this book and being the moderator of the Bitter Medicine Book Club. This book, I will say personally, is an interesting read. It is at times a difficult read, only because the material at times can be dense. Also, Walter Rodney is intentionally repetitive. He's trying to drive this point home, so he repeats a number of things a lot of times. And lastly, it's a little bit difficult because you have to kind of know the geography of Africa, especially in ancient times, right? To kind of understand the scope for which he's talking about, like these different like the different kingdoms in Africa, and essentially the different tribes that, two tribes became one group, and that's how you started to have these states in Africa and stuff like that. But let's start from the beginning. Well, first, let me ask you, what are your overall thoughts of the book and your feelings of the book?
Well, my overall thought of the book is that I think this book tells an important story, and I think it's important to understand that the condition of not just the African continent, but African people globally, and how we got into the position that we are. What happened to derail Africa's development in such a way to where we're behind so much of the world. And the book really does an excellent part in, just going through the history and just giving an overall picture, because unfortunately, the society we live in, this racist society we live in, they like to frame the narrative as such that Africa and African people are just slow when there's something wrong with us, without leaving out the parts of the history that where Africa was robbed of its wealth and is still continually robbed of its wealth to this day. So I enjoyed the book. It is a dense read, and Walter Rodney, rest in peace to him. He was a very excellent scholar, and I enjoyed reading his works. And like I said, it's a really good book. It's a scholarly book. He does repeat things multiple times because, like you say, he's hammering the point home. He wants you to get this.
Absolutely. I actually think, for the listeners out there, I think this was a good book to not only read for its knowledge as it pertains to Africa through colonialism and where we stand as Africans now, home and abroad, but also I think it's a good lesson in writing, because I can tell that this book was a series of essays that he put together and made it into a book, and I think that's a part of the reason why it is so repetitive at times, because he wrote these individual essays on a main idea, and then he put it together, and so you're reading him kind of go over certain ideas over and over in each section, and that's fine too. But once you kind of got it, it becomes a little repetitive to keep hearing it all the time. So you mentioned something that's interesting. So we're gonna start off with chapter 1. In chapter 1, Walter discusses development versus underdevelopment, and he does this thing, and I'm gonna have you expand upon it a little bit. He does this thing that's very interesting and very necessary, because the thing about these white folks is that white supremacy is that they know how to use words in very specific ways. They know how to, they could derail an argument based on the misuse of a word. And
absolutely,
what Walter did is he defines what development is and underdevelopment, right? And he defines it in an interesting way. Can you tell the listeners, what does Walter say about development and non-development?
Well, what is development? He was saying how it can be used as an exclusive economic sense. The justification being that the type of economy of itself is an index of other social features. So there's economic development, there's social development, and there's also political development. But then you have what he calls underdevelopment as well, which is basically how the other countries are used to underdevelopment, meaning it's not the absence of he said, I'm sorry, on page 13, he said, obviously, underdevelopment is not an absence of development because every people have developed in one way or another. Underdevelopment only makes sense as means of comparing levels of development. It is very much tied to the fact that human social development has been uneven. From a strictly economic viewpoint, some human groups have advanced further than others by becoming more wealthy.
Absolutely. So Walter introduced the idea that, so what a lot of Europeans try to do, what a lot of white folks try to do, white supremacists try to do is they talk about underdevelopment like it's in a vacuum. Like it's totally on a group for their underdevelopment. And what Walter did that other scholars at the time had not been doing is he showed you that there's development, and on the flip side, there's underdevelopment. That you can't speak of one without speaking of the other, and so that's the so that's the paradigm that Africa falls in. Africa falls in this paradigm of Europe was able to develop on the strength of Africa.
Yes. And on page 14, I'm sorry, let me cut you off.
No,
he mentions how a second and more indispensable component of modern underdevelopment is that it expresses a particular relationship of exploitation, meaning the exploitation of one country by another. All of the countries named as underdevelopment in the world are exploited by others, and the underdevelopment with which the world is now preoccupied is a product of capitalist, imperialist, and colonial exploitation.
Exactly. So that also brings us to who Walter Rodney is as well. Now, Walter doesn't get into making a direct case for socialism, but Walter Rodney was a socialist. And,
yes, he was.
And, so his writing comes from a kind of a disdain for capitalism. Now, we're not going to discuss the pros and cons of capitalism here today. I will agree, though, that capitalism, the way it has been executed by Europeans, is predatory, and so it's wrong in that sense. But we'll talk about that another time as to the pros and cons of capitalism where the African is concerned. But let's now that we've talked about development and underdevelopment, and we understand the relationship between the two that Walter wanted to establish, let me just quickly, for those of you who are not aware or not familiar, there's different economic systems, right? And the economic systems formed out of the time when individuals were like single hunters and gatherers. And what happened was when the peoples of the earth were more single, more solitary hunters and gatherers, eventually they started to learn how to control nature, how to control the land. And that led into communalism. Communalism where the property was shared, the work was done in common. So you start being these single bands of hunters, you start forming these groups. You shared the property, you shared the work, and you shared the products of your labor equally. That was communalism. All societies underwent communalism at some point. Walter's point also in this book is that different groups developed at different times and in different magnitudes. So Africa by itself was on its own trajectory. Europe was on its own trajectory, Asia, etc. It's kind of like the conscious community now. People come into consciousness at different times, in different ways, and at different magnitudes. It's the same. It's not that anyone's arrival at consciousness is better. It's just different. It's just at a different time. So Europe isn't better or supreme to anyone else. They were just on a different time. And, as we will discuss later, when they started to underdevelop an Africa, for example, it allowed them to develop at a magnitude something like 25 times what it probably would have done had it not encountered and actually subjugated Africa. But just to continue with economic systems, Karl, for a second. So from communalism, what ended up happening was you had slavery. Slavery was where certain domineering elements within the family and some groups were able to overwhelm other groups. So you had slavery. In that economic system, you had two players: the master and the slave. And basically, the slave's job in that economy was to produce food via agriculture. Now, we're not talking about transatlantic slavery. We're talking about slavery on the world stage, right? I've always talked about it in the past on this show how slavery was a natural phenomenon. Whether you like it or not, it was a natural phenomenon. It was about power. Some people were able to overwhelm others. From slavery now, we move into feudalism. In feudalism, you still had the principle of agriculture, but instead now you had the land, which is the means of the production. You had the land being held by just a few people, right? And those few people not only held the land, but they controlled and took most of the wealth. In that feudalist system, the workers were known as serfs. They weren't personal property of the masters, but they were tied to the land. And even when the land was passed on to someone else, a landlord, they still were tied to that land. The serfs were only able to keep just enough food to feed themselves, and even their children. If you were a serf and you had children, your children were born into serfdom. And that sounds kind of like what we're dealing with today, right? Lastly, in feudalism, when you read about kings and knights, that was feudalism. There was the king at the top, the tenants-in-chief, the knights or the lords. Whenever you hear someone say their name is Lord such and such, that's a feudal society. And then you had the peasantry. And the peasantry did all the work, was able to generate all the produce, all the food, and the kings, the lords, the tenants-in-chief, they were the ones who held and controlled the land and all the wealth. And then lastly, you have what is capitalism. Capitalism was essentially the next step up from feudalism, is where wealth was created by machines, not agriculture. So that's where you had your factories, you had your mines. The wealth was in the hands of the few due to the unequal distribution of the products of human labor. And the few were the people who, during feudalism, who were the merchants and the craftsmen. They became the industrialists and the financiers. So you see the progression or the evolution of these systems in time. How people from one system became how like the overlords in one system became the overlords in the next. The serfs in capitalism were legally free to leave the land and go to search for employment in capitalist enterprises. In other words, they were able to commodify their labor, so their labor could be bought, sold, or refused. What you're going to see when we talk about this book further with Karl is that capitalist system was, how do I put it? That capitalist system was intensified on the Africans. So it wasn't the case where the African was necessarily legally free, but the African, as we will talk about later, was forced to essentially still work for the capitalists and for next to nothing. And then lastly is what I talked about, Walter Rodney's belief in socialism. Socialism was a prediction of what was to come after capitalism, and it was a return to communalism, where there was social ownership and the workers managed the means of production. That is, they managed the facilities, the resources, anything that was used to producing the goods, right? So they own the mode of production and the means of production. So that's just the backdrop of the economic system, so that when we go forward with this discussion, for those of you who weren't versed in those things can kind of follow along. Karl, let's continue with chapter 1. In chapter 1, Walter Rodney talks about how men were able to use tools, and in using those tools, they were able to organize labor. So basically, how well you could manipulate nature was how successful you would be in the community. I don't know if you heard this show I did some time ago where I spoke about ego. This is directly related to ego. Tools led to ego, led to economic systems.
Right.
The thing about it is that a lot of people don't realize is, at one point in history, Africans were ahead of everyone else in tools, in tool usage, in tool making.
Right.
As you know, Dr. John Henry Clark spoke about it a lot, where, Africans pull Europeans out of two dark ages, right? The dark ages of their inception and the dark ages after Rome fell, and they went into the second dark ages, right? So we get to see here that different places. This is just to support what Rodney's initial claim is in chapter 1. Different nations progressed at their own pace and at different times. Just like a classroom of children will learn, some will learn faster than others, but everyone will get there eventually. So the notion that Africa was backwards is just completely untrue. It was just opportunity that allowed Europe to progress ahead of Africa. What else do you want to add about chapter 1?
Well, I think I also want to kind of add how he mentioned how when you have two societies, one with less economic capacity and one with greater economic capacity, the weaker is bound to be adversely affected. And the bigger the gap between the two societies concerned, the more detrimental are the consequences.
Mm-hmm.
And he mentions on page 11 how when European capitalism came into contact with the indigenous hunting societies of America and the Caribbean, the latter were virtually exterminated.
Yeah.
So when you have two societies at different levels of development, depending on the gap, it could be disastrous.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's true of Africa, the Caribbean. That gap turned out to be not in our favor, so to speak.
Right.
But continue. What else from chapter 1 stood out to you?
One other thing on chapter 1 that he mentioned on page 21, that the interpretation of undevelopment is somehow ordained by God, is emphasized by the racist trend in European scholarship. It is in line with racist prejudice to say openly or to imply that their countries are more developed because their people are innately superior, and that the responsibility for economic backwardness of Africa lies in the generic backwardness of black Africans. An even bigger problem is that the people of Africa and other parts of the colonized world have gone through a cultural and psychological crisis and have accepted, at least partially, the European version of things. This means that the African himself has doubts about his capacity to transform and develop his natural environment. I think that's a very, very important point that we miss, that this development is not natural, but yet because we have accepted the Europeans' version of the world, we believe that we are innately inferior and can't do things for ourselves. This causes, in my opinion, the racial self-esteem that black people suffer from, the lack of self-esteem we have racially.
That's an interesting point, Karl, because now, to be clear, all of this happened around 1440 was the beginning of this encounter, if I'm not mistaken. And
Yeah, that was when the Portuguese first came to Africa and started taking captives.
yeah. And, that is hundreds of years ago. But the funny thing, and I've talked about this on the show before, is that we have something in us called DNA. And DNA carries memories. And so when you have something that happened hundreds of years ago and some form of it still persists, that DNA starts to play out in your psychology. Not only in your biology, but in your psychology. So like Karl, like you said, it is very true that we still carry, a lot of us, especially those not in consciousness, still carry a kind of inferiority complex, where we think that the European is just better and that God has something to do with it.
Right.
The notion that the European is God, or at least ordained by God, and they're just better. And so we have to follow them. We have to listen to them, and we must see ourselves as at the most second-class citizens to them. Karl, was there anything else in chapter 1 that stood out to you that we should point out?
No, I think we really did touch on the main points of how he introduces the book and kind of explains the definitions of underdevelopment and development. Yes, I think that's really, we can go on to chapter 2 if you like.
Okay, well, before we go into chapter 2, let me just add one thing. One of the things that Walter Rodney points out, which I thought very interesting, and I think it's something that I think all of us need to hear and to take in, is that when you're undergoing underdevelopment, underdevelopment takes away your ability to concentrate on your economy, on the parts of the economy that would generate growth. So what happens is, it's not, a lot of people deal in words and they say, oh, well, Africa was underdeveloped, but it's not just underdeveloped in terms of the resources being taken from Africa, but also the people in Africa, and this will come up, this was prominent in a later chapter, but the people in Africa were so busy trying to gather these resources to give or forcefully have to give these resources out to Europeans that they didn't have time to do the things for themselves that would generate growth, that would lead to development of themselves. So it's not just simply resources being taken. It's not like I come and I take some money out of your pocket. It's actually,
Right.
I have you so preoccupied that you can't even figure out how am I going to make money to replace what I took out of your pocket. You know what I mean?
Right. You're so busy trying to survive, you can't do anything else.
You're so busy trying to survive, you can't do anything else. And why I found that an important thing to point out is because, you listen to a lot of people, a lot of talking heads always say, well, black folks need to start more businesses and to do this and do that. And while I agree with that notion, I also understand that because of the system that we live under, let's say you're working 9 to 5 or 9 to 6, and you're in one of these cities. By the time your day revolves around that daily grind, that 9 to 5, 9 to 6, or whatever, or when you have your own time, you're so fatigued. You have so little of your own time too that you can't focus on what you need to do to further develop yourself. And so that's a lesson that I think every one of us, especially those of us still on the plantation, so to speak, have to consider. When you are developing someone else, you're often undeveloping yourself in the sense that you can't even focus on what you need to do to make greater things happen for you. You know what I mean?
Right.
So in chapter 2 focus on the developed nature of African societies, or I should say African territories, before the coming of the Europeans up to the 15th century. Karl, in that chapter, what items stood out to you about the developed nature of African territories before the coming of the Europeans? Because a lot of people make it seem like Africa was just backwards and the Europeans came and it was just a mess and the people were silly and all this kind of stuff. Karl, what did you take from that chapter that stood out to you about how developed certain African kingdoms and territories were even before Europeans came?
There was a high level of development all over the African continent. You have to understand, from a historical standpoint, Africa was the birthplace of humanity. We developed in Africa first before we left the African continent to travel the world. So when they mentioned many of the civilizations in that area, in the era of history, they were more advanced in many cases than the Europeans.
Yep.
And the Europeans were shocked and amazed when they came across these African societies that were developed well economically, socially, politically. So it's very interesting to note, prior to European involvement, that Africa was a golden age in and of itself.
Mm-hmm. So some of those societies, and Walter Rodney gets into it in some detail. This is why you have to read the book, because we can't get into all the detail now. But Walter talked about Egypt, Ethiopia, Nubia, Zimbabwe, the Maghreb, which is Northern Africa, Western Sudan, and I think a few others. And
the areas in between the African Great Lakes.
Yeah, there's a word he used that I wasn't familiar with. The
Lacustrine zone.
Yeah, something like that he said, which was interesting. He talked about those areas, and he said those cultures were impacted once the Europeans infiltrated those civilizations. And he goes on further in that chapter to talk about how Africa contributed to European capitalist development during the pre-colonial period, and how that contribution to Europe is what even widened the gap further. Does that stand out to you, Karl?
Yes, it certainly does. And one of the things he mentioned on page 69 in chapter 2, how he said several historians of Africa have pointed out that after surveying the developed areas of the continent in the 15th century and those within Europe at the same date, the difference between the two was in no way to Africa's discredit. Indeed, the first Europeans to reach West and East Africa by sea were the ones who indicated that in most respects, Africa's development was comparable to that which they already knew.
Interesting. Talk about that a little further. Like, break that down for listeners. Okay.
So he mentions a saying by the Dutch, that when the Dutch visited the city of Benin, and they described it, it says the town seems to be very great. When you enter into it, you go into a great broad street, which seems to be 7 or 8 times broader than the Warmost Street in Amsterdam. So he's comparing this city in Benin to Amsterdam, which is in the Netherlands, and he's noticing the development of this city in Africa, and it's no way lesser than what he's already developed. What he's already seeing in their home country.
I thought that was interesting. And later in the book, Walter references something a European said positively of Africa. It's slipping my mind what it is right now. And Walter added this note saying that there is no reason for these European invaders to give praises that are false. So if those Europeans came in and said it was like Amsterdam to them, it was like Amsterdam to them.
And then he also mentioned that.
Yeah.
He says, these people are in no way inferior to the Dutch as regards cleanliness. They wash and scrub their houses so well, they are polished and shining like a looking glass. So even at that point, they noticed how clean the society was, how organized it was.
That just goes to show you guys out there that without a doubt, and we're talking like a real historical analysis on the part of Walter Rodney here. We're not talking, street corner history. We're not talking hidden colors even here. We're talking real analysis, real scholarly research that pull these quotes that says that shows you that Africa was indeed developed before Europeans came. It had nothing to do with European input. And so it kind of proves that Europeans weren't even necessary in those areas. Had Africa been left to its own devices, what you saw on screen as Wakanda could have been Africa in real, had there not been, and I'm a firm believer, had Africa not been ever in contact with Europe in the way that it was, Africa would have been technologically advanced. Not to say that Europe would not have, because as Walter Rodney discusses later in the book, he doesn't say it quite like I'm saying it, but to say that Africa, actually he says it like this. He says to say that Europe only became Europe because of Africa would be kind of simple-minded to say, right? There definitely Africa contributed to Europe, but what Walter was trying to get across was that, like he did in the first chapter, all societies progress. All societies progress. They just take their different times to do it. So Europe would have still done something, of course, but Africa had it not been touched, maybe it might have taken a little bit longer, but I think at the end, it would have been purer. It would have been, I hate to use the terms good and evil, but it wouldn't have been evil, like the evil empires we see coming out of Europe. Karl, was there anything else in chapter 2 that stood out to you that we should point out?
Only on page 69, he mentions that it should be reiterated that slavery as a mode of production was not present in any African society. Although some slaves were to be found, with the decomposition of communal equality had gone furthest. This is an outstanding feature illustrating the autonomy of the African path within the broader framework of universal events.
Interesting.
So I think that's very important how he mentions that even though slavery is a byproduct, evolves out of communalism, it had not yet reached that level within African society.
Beautiful point. Excellent point. At the beginning of the show, I talked about the evolution of the economics, right? And I mentioned after communalism was slavery. You brought up a good point. That's to be when you talk about that slavery coming out of communalism, that was in Europe really, where there was slavery. In Africa, for all intents and purposes, had jumped over from communalism to slavery, right? They kind of skipped that. There was no real slavery in Africa, and I'm tired of arguing that point with a lot of black folks. You know what I mean? But there wasn't when Skip Gates said in that PBS thing to Tom Joyner,
I remember
that slavery was big business for Africans. Skip Gates is being completely intellectually dishonest.
He is, and he's certainly leaving out the fact that that slavery was big business to Africa, but it was a result of the Europeans' desire for slavery that made it a big business.
Exactly.
And they go into this further in this book. Slavery was not a trade in the way we think of any trade as buying and selling. It was an act of violence.
Yes. And you didn't see slavery on the continent really until Europeans came by. Karl, let me take a quick station break. When we come back, we'll discuss chapter 3 onwards, okay?
Okay.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions. Black people face one problem: the problem of ignorance. This is why those who opposed us stole us from our parents, disconnected us from our continent, and enforced on us illiteracy. But now the ignorance is self-inflicted. We send our children to their machines. We detach ourselves from our motherland, and we don't read meaningful literature. Consciousness is a series of stages. The sooner we get to one, the sooner we are ready for the higher. The pro-black compendium accelerates the beginner to the advanced and provides for the advanced an unparalleled breadth. This is the sort of book your enemies do not want you to read, but our ancestors would insist you read twice. Peace Seeker, this is Oni from the pro-black perspective, and we need power. Power will not be handed to us. We need to build power. But in order to build power, we need a power blueprint. You need to study the best blueprints available. You have Gardners. You have Wilsons. You have Williams. You have mine. Now, you'll have Cooks. Carlos A. Cooks was Garvey's best student, the greatest mind in the world from 1940 to 1966. Yes, the greatest. Yet Whitey doesn't want you to read his blueprint. Cook's blueprint isn't religious. Cook's isn't for integration. Cook's isn't for communism. Cook's isn't even for anti-blacks. Cook's blueprint is for Africa. And Cook's blueprint is the unknown blueprint that was the basis of black power as we know it today. When you say buy black, you're talking about Cooks. When you say black is beautiful, you're talking about Cooks. When you say Malcolm got something right, you're talking about Cooks. But Cook's blueprint was lost, and Whitey is hiding that blueprint behind a $1,000 paywall. He's hiding solutions from you, telling you you need to take out a small loan to get the information that can liberate you. Whitey does not want you to have solutions to your problems, but you need solutions. You need power. I will give you the Carlos A. Cooks Reader, valued over $1,000 at a 98% discount, $15. Send $15 to cash.me/$ABSONI with the subject Carlos and your email address, and I'll send you the ebook. We need power. You need blueprints. Start building today.
Greetings, family. This is Koku, host of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. In case you didn't know, we have an online book club called the Bitter Medicine Book Club. Every month, we will select a book to inspire the Bitter Medicine Podcast listening audience to read along together. At the end of the month, we will have a call-in show and book discussion. This is a great, dynamic way for readers to not only enjoy a book, but also have others to bounce ideas off of. They say if you want to keep anything away from black people, put it in a book. Don't allow this to be true. Head over to bittermedicineblogs.com and subscribe to our newsletter for important updates. Do that today. Join our reading collective today and empower yourselves, your family, and your community. Peace and blessings.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. On today's show, we are discussing the book by Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. I'm joined by the Bitter Medicine Book Club moderator, that's Karl Hezekiah. We left off from the previous segment discussing I think we were about to get into chapter 3. Chapter 3 of the book was titled Africa's Contributions to the Capitalist Development of Europe, the Colonial Period. So now, our discussion before was pre-colonial. We established, Karl did, that Africa was doing just fine before Europeans came. Before there was any involvement of Europeans, Africans had territories and kingdoms that rivaled what Europe had going on. Karl, in chapter 3, what things stand out to you concerning Africa's contributions to the capitalist development of Europe?
Well, this is something that I thought was very interesting in this book. It says how Europe became the dominant section of a worldwide trade system. And one thing that he mentioned in the book is that on page 75, the Europeans took the initiative and went to other parts of the world. No Chinese boats reached Europe, and if Africans reached the Americas, they did not establish two-way links. So what was called international trade was nothing but the extension overseas of European interests. The strategy behind international trade and production and supported it was firmly in European hands. So when we speak of like the way Europe became the dominant section of the worldwide trade system, understand he's saying that basically how international law, which governs the conduct of nations on the high seas, is nothing else than European law. He mentions that on page 77. Europeans were also able to unload on the African continent goods which had become unsellable in Europe. So things like old weapons, beads, alcohol, things that could not be sold in Europe, they would be able to be sent to Africa in guaranteed markets. So this is one way how the European began to dominate by their control of the sea trade, and also by their using Africa as a market for their old goods was one way how the European came to dominate economically the African continent. And they also, on page 76, he mentions that the European countries decided on the role to be played by the African economy. So they were the ones who determined what goods were to be bought and to be sold, and what items were so suitable for trade within their system.
Karl, you brought up something there that when I was younger, I used to wonder, so they kind of trivialize, and these white folks know what they're doing too. When they tell the story of Manhattan, and they say that Manhattan was purchased for a handful of beads or something like that. What a lot of folks don't understand, and I think it's important to say here as well, in human development, currency took different forms. At one point, currency, even though nations were far apart, Europe was where it is, Africa was where it is, Asia is where it is, all of those nations had the cowrie. Is that the name of it? It's like
the cowrie shell. Yes.
Yeah, the cowrie shell. It's like it's a sea snail, and those shells were used as money, right? And people were paid or they traded shells. So when you and then later it was beads, but currency took different forms before it became paper currency, right? And so when you hear those stories about Africans or Indian, Native Americans or whatever being sold stuff for beads and all that kind of stuff, understand that that was currency in those territories, in those areas.
Right.
So it wasn't that the people receiving the beads or the shells was just some silly folks. This was what it was. You know what I mean?
Right.
Coinage didn't happen until much later. You know what I'm saying? So that's what I want people to understand. But Karl, you made a good point there to bring up that Walter Rodney talks about how the Europeans were the first to really monetize foreign trade, essentially, right?
Exactly. And also he mentions on page 77, something else I really want to mention. He says that Europeans were anxious to acquire gold in Africa because there was a pressing need for gold coin within the growing capitalist money economy. But since gold was limited to small areas of Africa as far as Europeans were then aware, the principal export was human beings. Now, we just mentioned before how they said that they were the ones to determine what items were to be bought and what items to be sold. He said in Senegal there was gum, in Sierra Leone there was wood, and in Mozambique there was ivory. However, even after taking these things into account, one considered Europe allocated to Africa the role of supplier of human captives to be used as slaves in various parts of the world. So this is what based on their economic system, they determined that their need was not for any, unfinished goods at that point in time, but it was actually for manpower.
Mm-hmm. And it's also... I'm sorry, go ahead, Karl. Continue.
No. I was going to say on the next page, he mentioned on page 78 how, obviously, if Europe could tell Africans what to export, that was an expression of European power. However, it would be a mistake to believe it was overwhelming military power. Europeans found it impossible to conquer Africans during the early centuries of trade, except in isolated spots on the coast. European power resided in their system of production, which was at that time a somewhat higher level than Africa's. European society was leaving feudalism and was moving towards capitalism. African society was then entering a phase comparable to feudalism. So I think that's very interesting how in our last book we spoke about King Leopold's ghost. We talked about how the Portuguese came to the Congo, but they were not fully able to enter the interior until European technological development had overwhelmingly surpassed that of the African people living there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that stood out. I highlighted that section too in the book because that further goes to prove that Africans weren't subjugated just by word. Right. It shows that Africans resisted, number one, and they lost their resistance because the European had better military technology. And that's a thing that we always need to hammer home, that if you leave us on equal planes, on an equal playing field, we would not be conquered.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And he says European technological superiority did not apply to all aspects of production, but the advantage which they possessed in a few key areas proved decisive. For example, he mentioned that the Africans in West Africa had developed metal casting to a fine artistic perfection in many parts of Nigeria. Mm-hmm. But when it came to the meeting with Europe, beautiful bronzes were less relevant than the crudest cannon. Mm-hmm. So, even though Africans had reached a level of a high artistry, the few advantages that Europeans had in some areas proved to be overwhelming when it came to the conflict.
Mm-hmm. It's it's kind of like bringing a knife to a gunfight, right? It's like
basically you can bring a beautiful knife, but someone has an old raggedy gun, and then you're in trouble.
Yeah, you're in trouble. And so, just to make it clear, what Karl is saying, what Walter was saying in that chapter there, is the Africans were exquisite in their ability to bend metal, to extract metal and to turn it into other things. They turned it into beautiful art, which Europeans stole, by the way, and won't return. But the Africans were not, at that time, even thinking about turning that metal into a gun. It just happened that Europe was further ahead of us in that respect. And I think a large part of that has to do with they were just further ahead of us in savagery and warfare. So they were able to they realized they'll turn that metal into a weapon. And then their interactions with Asia, they got gunpowder. And so that was what led to the subjugation. Karl, is there anything else you want to add from that chapter?
There's actually several things I wanted to mention.
Okay, go for it. Let me stop talking and you talk.
Thing. All right.
Yeah.
Well, this is what he mentions when it comes down to the African slave trade. And he quotes, he's saying that some African rulers found European goods sufficiently desirable to hand over captives which had already been taken in warfare. But soon this warfare developed between one community to another between the sole purpose of getting prisoners for sale for Europeans. So this is something that, we often hear people say, oh, black people sold each other into slavery. And I think that's a oversimplification of the history behind it. And what he mentions is that a reaction was started by European demand for slaves and only slaves, and by their offer of consumer goods. This process being connected to divisions within African society. So on page 80, he mentions that African opposition to the slave trade. And in the previous book we read talked about the Kingdom of the Congo. The slave trade did not get underway without doubts from the king, and how the king asked for masons, physicians, and clerks and priests, but he was overwhelmed by slave ships sent from Portugal. And a vicious trade was opened up by playing off one part of the Congo kingdom of another. Now, the king of the Congo had conceived of possibilities of mutually beneficial interchange between its people and the European state. But because Europe set the parameters of what was to be sold and what was not to be sold, they forced him to specialize in the selling of slaves. So this is something that we often overlook when we talk about how, black people sold each other. They were pressured due to European desire for human captives. And then he mentions also on page 80 that once the trade in slaves had been started in any part of Africa, it soon became clear that it was beyond the capacity of any single African state to change the slaves, to change the situation. So I hear some black people, especially some of these newer ones, these descendants of slaves, as they like to call themselves, complain about how they never sent any ships for us. It was beyond the capacity of one African nation to mount a rescue mission. And, he mentions Queen Nzinga in Angola fighting against the Portuguese again. She was able to coordinate resistance, but the Portuguese gained the upper hand. So it allowed them to be conquered. He also mentions in the African kingdom of Dahomey, which opposed the European slave traders and deprived the Europeans of imports. He says between 1724 and 1726, he looted and burned European forts and slave camps and reduced the trade from the slave coast to a mere trickle by blocking paths leading to sources to supply in the interior. European slave dealers were very bitter, and they tried to sponsor some African collaborators against the king of Dahomey, Aja Trudeau. They failed to unseat him or crush the Dahomean state, but in turn, the king failed to persuade them to develop new lines of economic activity. And being anxious to acquire firearms and cavalry from the Europeans, had to agree on the resumption of slave trading in 1730. So we see how these European nations set it up so that way slave trade was the only thing that Africans could sell and trade.
If I could just interject for a second,
Yes, sir.
I liken this to someone has you in a chokehold. When someone has you in a chokehold and that's secure, there's very little you can do. There's very, very little you can do against it. They have you at their will. And so the Africans found themselves suddenly at the will, the whim and fancy of these Europeans. And so when
Right.
the Yvette Carnels of the world and folks of that ilk who start talking about, well, how come Africans didn't come and try rescue us? They were subjugated themselves.
Exactly.
And the tactic that the Europeans used, which I spoke about when I talked about the anti-African narrative that Yvette Carnel and folks like that have, they use divide and conquer tactics where they isolate small groups, as you mentioned earlier. They isolate these smaller groups, and that's how they conquer them. They make sure that they can't link with any powerful or more powerful group than themselves, and they keep them down and oppressed in that way. When you're isolated and oppressed, you can't save anyone. You can't even save yourself.
Exactly.
You know, continue, Karl.
Okay. This is something also that he talks about in chapter 3 about how Africa's contribution to the economy in early capitalist Europe. Basically, without African labor, the West Indies were valueless. They needed, in order for the West Indies to produce and become the center of economic development for the early capitalist society, early European society, they needed the slave trade. On page 83, he mentioned how Karl Marx pointed out that what was good for Europeans was obtained at the expense of untold suffering by Africans and American Indians. The discovery of gold and silver in America, the enslavement and atonement of the minds of the Aboriginal population, the turning of Africa into a commercial warren for the hunting of black skins, signaled the rosy dawn in the era of capitalist production. It's hard to kind of quantify the amounts of wealth that was taken from the African continent, and how that basically was used to turn these colonies into the producers that they did become.
Mm-hmm.
He also this is something he mentions on page 87. It says slavery is useful for early accumulation of capital, but is too rigid for industrial development. Slaves had to be given crude, non-breakable tools, which held back the capitalist development of agriculture and industry. That explains the fact that the northern portions of the USA gained far more industrial benefits from slavery than the South, which actually had slave institutions on its soil.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very interesting how the presence of slavery in Africa helped retard development on the African continent, but it helped increase development in other places where they did not have it.
Mm-hmm. Excellent point. Excellent thing to point out. I'm pretty sure you're gonna talk about that again later when people talk about, well, the British had a change of heart and they were against slavery, and they were just as much against it as it was previously for it. No, there's a reason why they were against it, and Karl just kind of touched on that, why they were against slavery. But continue, Karl.
Well, yes, that is very true. It wasn't through altruistic reasons that they ended slavery in the British. It was more so it was stifling their economic development as far as their industrialism. Mm-hmm. And also they got tired of the constant slave revolts that were occurring in their colonies as well. Mm-hmm. So this is chapter 3. I really enjoyed the chapter, how he mentions on page 88, how it says, in the most striking feature is undoubtedly the rise of racism as a widespread and deeply rooted element of European thought. The role of slavery in promoting racist prejudice and ideology has been carefully studied in certain situations, especially the USA. The simple fact is no people can enslave another for centuries without coming out with the notion of superiority. And when the color and physical traits of those peoples were quite different, it was inevitable that prejudice should take a racist form.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful point. You want to explain that a little bit further?
Yes. People have to justify their behaviors.
Yes.
We have this cognitive dissonance. People like to think of themselves as generally good and kind. So when they do something unkind, they don't want to think of themselves as being something wrong with them. They have to transfer the negative to the other. So what they've done in this situation is that Black African people were enslaved because they needed African labor. But beyond that, they had to justify their mistreatment of the African. So at that point, the African then became enslaved. They became inferior. They then became based on their race.
Mm-hmm.
Slavery developed originally as an economic means because they needed the labor. They weren't willing to do it for themselves. But they added the racist part onto it later to justify their cruel actions.
Right. And it's the racist part that still really exists now.
Yes.
When these cops are killing your kids in the streets, I've heard people say this kind of thing. Oh, it's about economics. Nope, it's about race, because they don't know what your bank account looks like when they kill your children in the street, right? It's about racial hatred that stems from this period of time when Africa was being exploited and underdeveloped by Europe. Karl, anything else you want to talk about in that chapter?
One more thing. You mentioned on page 89, it says, how else can one explain the fact that the Christian church participated fully in the maintenance of slavery and still talked about saving souls? The hypocrisy reached its highest levels inside the USA. The first martyr in the American National War of Liberation against the British colonists in the 18th century was an African descendant, Crispus Attucks. This is a black man who died for the freedom of a country that wouldn't free him.
Yeah. You know this too. I talk about that with some frequency on this show. And Walter talks about it later in the book too. Just as a preview, I guess. He talks about how a lot of black folks, Africans, fought for Europeans, hoping that Europeans will see their worth and will then start to ease up on them. And I have a problem with that thinking. I've never believed in that. I never understood, especially when you go back 100 or 200 years ago, how how Africans were fighting for America, for Europeans. And even to this day, I still, no disrespect to those of you who have put your lives on the line fighting for country, but it never really gelled well with me that you would fight for a country that really didn't give a shit about you to begin with. And
that's true.
And will not be moved by your sacrifice. Let's understand that too. It just will not be moved by your sacrifice. You could sacrifice all you want, they're not going to care. Some of you will serve in the military for Europeans, and upon returning home, upon retiring or what have you, you could be gunned down in the street just like any civilian. We saw it with what's the guy, Walter Scott, was it?
Walter Scott, yeah, he was a former Marine. They shot him 8 times in the back.
Didn't give a good damn the sacrifice he laid down for the country. So that always bothered me. And then, as you know, it also always bothered me that Africans would adhere to a religious or a religion that, as John Henry Clark put it, the master is praying to the same God as the slave. Who do you think that God's going to respond to? And when we look around, who does that God respond to? Still the master. So it always bothered me that people would put, I'm not saying you can't be religious, if that's what you want to do, so be it. But when people put that above their blackness, when people put America above its blackness. Like me and Onita say, were talking in the last broadcast that I dropped about LeBron's school. When LeBron was talking about his school, LeBron, first thing he did was raise an American flag. Once he did that, I already knew what was the deal. You know what I mean? So,
Right.
you know, those are two issues I have, and I was happy to see Walter Rodney point this out. You know, when he wrote this book. Karl, as far as chapter 3, I give you the last words.
All right. Page 89, he says, it can be further argued that by the 19th century, white racism had become so institutionalized in the capitalist world, and notably in the USA, that it sometimes ranked above the maximization of profit as a motive for oppressing black people. I say to my friends that white people don't mind losing a foot if black people will lose a leg.
Yep.
They will put racism above profit. The need to hurt black people, they will hurt each other.
Mm-hmm.
That is a sick, pathological need that we're probably going to discuss more. I don't want to give too many spoilers about next month's book, but we're going to go into more detail in next month's book about that pathology.
Right. Is that your final word in chapter 3?
That's my final word for chapter 3, yes.
Yeah, chapter 3 was a very good read, man. It really solidified a lot of the thoughts I had about our condition presently, and so I really enjoyed that chapter. Let's move on to chapter 4.
Yes. Chapter 4, he starts off in the very beginning, how the European slave trade is a basic factor in African underdevelopment. And one thing he mentions is on page 95, he says, on the whole, the process in which captives were obtained on African soil was not trade at all. We need to think of these things as not trade. It was through warfare, trickery, banditry, and kidnapping. When one tries to measure the effect of European slave trading on the African continent, it is essential to realize that one is measuring the effect of social violence rather than trade in any normal sense of the word. I think that's very important to understand that.
Speak on it.
So it's not something that was done as a way to, we're going to trade this for you, we're going to trade this for you. It was violence. They would give weapons to one group, give weapons to another group, and no matter who won or who lost, they still were able to obtain captives.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So this is something that became disastrous on the African societies of the time, and it directly bears a part in Africa's condition and African people globally condition. On one page, on page 97, there's a chart that lists the population growth throughout the world over 100 years of period. So it goes from 1650, 1750, 1850, and 1900. Every continent, they have Europe and Asia listed, showing an increase in population with the exception of Africa. Africa's population is staying steady. There's no increase in population until the abolishment of the slave trade. At that point, you then see an increase. But how can society develop if the population is constantly being taken?
Yeah, right.
You mentioned that earlier. People are struggling to survive. They're not going to be, innovating technologies. They're going to be trying to hide and find food and protect their families.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
So, he mentions on page 76, the massive loss to the African labor force was made more critical because it was composed of able-bodied young men and young women. Slave buyers preferred their victims between the ages of 15 and 35, and preferably in the early 20s. The sex ratio being about 2 men to 1 woman. So this is something that they purposely went after the most productive members of that society.
That's like what goes on now. What goes on now with Africa and Africans is, I've talked about it in the past, is the brain drain, significant brain drain.
Yes.
Comes out of Africa and goes right to Europe, France, and the like. And in fact, the recent World Cup in soccer was won by France, and you'll be hard pressed to find a real European on that team. the big names on that team are all African.
All African people, yep.
And so we still see it today. There's not only brain drain, but how do I put this? Physical capacity, athleticism drain. So there's several types of draining from Africa that started then and still persists now. And as I mentioned earlier, and Karl just reminded, when you start pulling those folks out of the continent, or even if you don't pull them out of the continent, but you make them have to be focused on gathering souls, or
yes,
there's no time to develop Africa. So
right.
That brain drain will develop Europe, or whoever is going to, that brain power is going to, and you're going to underdevelop Africa. So for those of you listening, before I let Karl continue, anytime you have these white folks coming at you talking some dumb stuff, you have to break down the argument like this. The reason why Europe was able to get so far ahead of Africa is because you used African brain power and mind power to build up your society, to build up your wealth, and at the same time, you took that brain power and that mind power from being able to do anything for Africa. So, of course, there's a gap. Of course, Africa and Europe are going in two opposite directions because you took the people from the continent who would have built her up. You know what I mean?
Right, right. He mentions that on page 105. The European slave trade was a direct block in removing millions of youth and young adults who were the human agents from whom inventiveness springs. Those who remained in areas badly hit by slave capturings were preoccupied about their freedom rather than in improvements in production.
You see, that's exactly my point. Continue, Karl.
Yeah. Okay. He also mentions how he mentioned about the borrowing of technology. That when a society, for whatever reason, finds itself technologically trailing behind others, it tries to catch up not by so much of invention, but by borrowing. And he mentions how in Africa, the only non-European society that really borrowed from Europe and became on Europe's level was that of the Japanese. Mm-hmm. In Africa, they hunted elephants and captives, but it really did not require any real demand for anything other than guns. There was no incentive to improve the production of food or anything else, metalworking. They really just wanted bigger and better guns, which to steal and rob from the continent.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting point. Continue, Karl.
Mm-hmm. He mentions how on the European, on page 108, the European has always discouraged technological evolution in Africa, and it blocks Africa's access to its own technology. Many times we understand that many of the inventions that we see today are developed by Black people, and yet we really gain no true development from it.
Right.
And that's something that, comes from the result of this society. We have these inventions. Black people have been used to oppress each other. Many of the weapons, the technology, the communications are not used to the development of African people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All right. So that's let me see. There's a couple other things I want to touch on. He mentions that some of those areas of Africa that were free from slave trading, even though they may not have had direct contact with the slave trade, it was still caused Africa to be undeveloped within that time in history. So he says on page 145 that it is widely accepted that Africa was colonized because of its weaknesses. This concept of weakness should be understood to embrace military weakness and inadequate economic capacity, as well as certain political weaknesses. namely the incompleteness of the establishment of nation states, which left the continent divided, and the low level of consciousness concerning the world at large, which had already been transformed into a single system. So we mentioned before how the European had been developed from communalism to slavery to feudalism to capitalism, where many African states were just now reaching a state similar to feudalism.
Mm-hmm.
So this left the African continent vulnerable to the Europeans.
Yeah, because with feudalism, that's when you have your military
Right.
being really fine-tuned, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. You know, in this chapter, Walter really wanted to get across was how the African under capitalism, the African was left underdeveloped versus the European, but it also showed itself with the African people themselves. So, like, I think he started talking about this in chapter 3, right?
Right.
He was discussing how the Africans, due to the discrimination that you talked about, how the African workers were so exploited. There's a part in this chapter, if I'm remembering correctly, where he talks about how Europeans were making so much more than Africans. Am I correct?
Right, that is correct. Chapter, the amount they were producing, right.
Yeah. So I just wanted to point that out too, that there's the bigger African picture, but there's also the smaller African individual and how they were affected on a day-to-day basis. But generally, again, like I said at the start of the show, Walter Rodney does a lot of repetition. So he almost introduces the main thesis at the start of each of these chapters, and you have to kind of go through it again and again. But the idea was that, you know, the African wasn't a backwards person.
Not at all.
It's just that where they were in their timeline of development was different from the European, and so that led to being a weakness, as you pointed out, militarily.
Right.
You know?
Mm-hmm. And he mentions he talks about some of the European ideas of when they met the Zulu, for example. And he talks about, you know, one European had this to say about Shaka, Napoleon, Julius Caesar, Hannibal, Charlemagne. Such men as these have arisen periodically throughout history of the world to blaze a trail of glory that has raised them above the common level. Such a man was Shaka, the greatest of them all. And this is something that a white person had wrote, not a black person.
Mm-hmm.
But he mentions how, you know, this is that African society that was free from European colonial possession could produce a man like that. He says on page 131, had Shaka been a slave to some cotton planter in Mississippi or some sugar planter in Jamaica, he might have had an ear or hand chopped off for being a recalcitrant nigger, or at best he might have distinguished himself leading a slave revolt. For the only great men among the unfree and oppressed are those who struggle to destroy the oppressor.
Powerful, powerful part of that book. Break that down for the people.
If you're not working, if someone's foot is on your neck and you're not working to remove that foot from off your neck, you can't really consider yourself to be great, to be someone who's trying to change the status quo. You have to struggle to destroy the people who are oppressing you. That needs to be your goal. And this is what I really like that quote by him. Mm-hmm. The only great men among the unfree and oppressed are those who struggle to destroy the oppressor.
And I love, in fact, I'm going to do a show all about Shaka Zulu too.
I love that.
Yeah, I'm gonna that part of that chapter where he talks about Shaka, how he came up the ranks in the Amazulu and stuff. That is that's a powerful chapter. And that thing that he said, had Shaka been on a plantation in the West Indies or something like that, he would have lost a hand
Right.
or a foot. That just tells you
Yeah.
what oppression does and what freedom means. When you're free, you can do so much. You can innovate. You can not just create, but innovate. You could transcend. And so the European oppression on Africa, not only did it take out some of the, the intellectuals or, what have you, but it also, because of its oppression, it made it so that the people couldn't be great. You see what I'm saying?
Right. Exactly.
And I think Walter Rodney did a great job there, showing you, don't come and talk about Africans are backwards and this, that, and the other, right? When in reality, you know that, as you said, Karl, you had your foot on their necks. You can't be great laying on the ground with someone's foot on your neck.
Exactly.
But continue, Karl.
This is something he mentions on that in the same chapter. He says that development is really a matter of building upon what is inherited and advancing slowly, provided no one comes to civilize you, as we see what happened in Africa with many of these peoples and these groups. They were advancing on their own level, and then the European brought, quote unquote, civilization.
And if I remember correctly, when he said civilized that first time, he had it in italics to kind of
quotation marks.
Either italics or quotations to kind of bring across the idea of sarcasm. So this so-called civilizing force, as we saw in the book King Leopold's Ghost, you claiming that you're civilizing the people, but nah. Had you let Africa just be, we would have found our way just as fine. You know what I mean?
Yes, and he does mention that on page 138, how King Leopold of Belgium used the anti-slavery excuse to introduce into Congo forced labor and modern slavery. Besides, all Europeans have derived ideas of cultural and racial superiority between the 15th and 19th century while engaging in genocide and enslavement of non-white peoples. Even Portugal, an impoverished and backward European nation in the imperialist area, could still presume that it had a destiny to civilize the natives in Africa. So even the poorest states in Europe still felt the desire to bring us civilization when their situation was already messed up.
And I love that line because history makes it seem like Portugal was this great power, when in reality, Portugal was just pretty much good at shipbuilding and sailing.
Basically. Right.
That was their claim to fame. But as Walter Rodney points out, at the time of colonialism, they weren't shit.
No, they were not. They were quickly passed by the Spanish and the British and the French. Mm-hmm. They were left behind. Even when they had Brazil as a colony, they quickly, were superseded by other European powers.
Yeah.
But yet they still felt the need to civilize the African people, though.
Because the civilized, in quotation marks, isn't really civilized, right? It's
exactly.
It's exploitation. It's capitalist exploitation. And later on, not to give too much spoilers, but later on, we're going to, I can't remember whether this chapter or the next, but Italy comes up. And the Italians were somewhat like Portugal, right? The Italians fought to enter into colonialism, and that's what the whole Italian-Ethiopian War was against His Majesty Selassie I. They were trying to.
Italy was backwards.
Yeah,
and because they were a little late to the game, like Belgium, in trying to obtain colonies for themselves, because Italy did not become an independent nation. They weren't becoming a united nation until the 1870s. Mm-hmm. By that point, most of the stuff that was to be gotten was already gotten. They tried to expand Ethiopia. They were pushed back. And then they finally, in 1870, by the Ethiopians. It wasn't until the beginning of the Second World War that the Italians were able to really gain a foothold in Africa.
Excellent point. Excellent point. That's good history right there. Karl, is there anything else from this chapter?
We can definitely move on to chapter 5. I enjoyed chapter 4. I enjoyed 4. The entire book.
No, the book is a good read. I mean, I don't want anyone who didn't have a chance to read the book with us during the month. Like I say all the time, you guys can still join the conversation. You can go to www.bittermedicineblogs.com and navigate to the book club page, and you can still use the affiliate links to order the book. And the discussion doesn't have to stop with this podcast. On YouTube, you can use the comment section to bring up certain thoughts and ideas that you have. You can definitely post in the comment section on the podcast page at www.bittermedicinepodcast.com. Engage with us on Facebook. Karl and I will be glad to have a discussion. But yeah, the whole book is a good book. Like I said, there's repetition, but I think the repetition is good, especially if you're not familiar with some of the histories of Africa and Europe and some of the economic systems that both of them had in common and stuff like that. So it's a good read, but that chapter, especially when he starts talking about the Zulu, oh man, that was a great chapter. So we can move on to chapter 5. If you're ready, Karl.
I'm ready.
All right. Chapter 5 is about colonialism as a system for undeveloping Africa.
Yes.
Go ahead, Karl.
He mentions on page 150 that while capitalism was willing to exploit all workers everywhere, European capitalists in Africa had additional racial justifications for dealing unjustly with the African worker. This racist theory that the black man was inferior led to the conclusion that he deserved lower wages. And interesting enough, the light-skinned Arab and the Berber populations of North Africa were treated as blacks by the white racist French. So now we have, in the beginning, we talked about how the Africans were enslaved, and yet they used racism as a justification for their enslavement. Now they're coming with racism as a justification to pay black workers less and to exploit them worse than they would exploit European workers.
Yeah.
He mentions this on page 150. Workers in Europe and North America were paid much higher wages. The Nigerian coal miner in Enugu earned 1 shilling per day for working underground and 9 pence per day for jobs on the surface. Such a miserable wage would be beyond the comprehension of a Scottish or German coal miner who could virtually earn in an hour what the Enugu coal miner was paid for a 6-day week. Yeah. They're already being exploited. Now you're paying them at a wages that's starvation wages. You can't live off of that.
Mm-hmm. No.
So this is something that he mentions in the Bible. I really thought that was just very telling. Once the formal slave trade ended, there was still wage slavery.
Yes. Continue, Karl.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No.
Mention something?
No, you go ahead because I don't want to jump the gun and hit a point that you were building up to. So you go ahead.
Right. This is something that he mentions on page 151. The fact is that the higher standard was made possible by the exploitation of colonies, and there was no justification for keeping African living standards so depressed in an age where better was possible and a situation where the higher standard was possible because of the work output of the Africans themselves. The Africans workers were already producing at such a high level, they could afford to have been given higher wages, but they simply were not, simply because they were black people.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this is something that even after the slave trade ended, the exploitation never stopped. It's something that continued. On page 151, he mentions there was a mine disaster in the Gold Coast. And he says 41 Africans were killed in a gold mine disaster in the Gold Coast. and the company offered only £3 to the dependents of each of these men as compensation. That's exploitation without responsibility and without redress.
Yeah.
So it's something that we never really speak of within how these conditions operate. And then he also mentions how European trading companies. Now we're just talking about just the excess, the part of the surplus that was produced by African wage workers, but the African interest rates and the banking, how that exploited African people as well. He talks about on page 155, the rate of interest on the loans was always fantastically high. In East Africa, things were so bad that even the British colonial government had to step in and enact a native credit ordinance to protect Africans from Asian businesses. Now, you know it's bad when the European have to step in and say, hey, your guys are getting out of hand.
Yeah.
Exploiting these people. You know it's bad then.
There was something in this chapter that stood out to me. When you mentioned the mines,
right.
The Europeans, Rodney said something like, you just said it too. He said the Europeans, you couldn't get Europeans to endure those conditions. And,
right, you couldn't.
And a thing that Walter says, if not in that chapter as well, but elsewhere in that book, is that what you have to understand is it wasn't that Africans were these dopey people who just did whatever and you know would do whatever Europeans didn't want to do. What does the capitalists? So basically, we're in capitalism now, and not just capitalism,
right.
but we're in capitalist imperialism at this point now, right?
Yes. Yes,
and
right.
What
complete exploitation. There's no type of fairness. This is complete naked exploitation.
Yeah, complete bare naked exploitation. And what you have to understand is, and this is necessary because this goes on with us here now. The capitalists, the Europeans, the savages, what they did and what they still do is they tip the scales in their favor. So they make it that there's nothing else you could do but go down in those mines and do the work.
Right.
You couldn't set up your own farm or something like that because, and if you did set up a farm, it was some cash crop that they had, that they wanted, and basically you were forced to sell for them. And so I want you guys who are listening to understand that it wasn't just Africans was just some docile people who were told to go down in these mines in these unfavorable conditions and do the work. No, it was the case where the capitalist imperialists made it so that you had to do that or to survive, right?
Basically, yeah.
Yeah. Continue.
Yeah, and then the price of goods was completely out of reach. So, and he mentioned in page 160, it says that the price of a finished cotton shirt was so high that when re-imported into Uganda, the cotton in the form of a shirt was beyond the purchasing power of the peasant who actually grew the cotton. So even though African people were producing the raw materials, once the finished product reached back to Africa, their wages were so low they couldn't even afford the finished product that had been produced by their labor.
And that's also a good point to bring up because it reminds me something else that was discussed earlier in the reading in the book is what you have to understand what Europeans did to Africa too. So the raw materials came from Africa, right?
Right.
Africans were using those same raw materials to make clothing and fabrics and this, that, and the other. But the Europeans were taking the raw material, making the finished products, and then flooding the African market with these European goods. So what that did was it made it so that the local African who had previously been making these little textiles and stuff like that and was selling them locally, they couldn't continue their business because the Europeans was flooding the markets with the material. And so we still see that happening now. Something that I've heard people bring up a lot now is the dashikis that a lot of conscious black folks wear is made in China.
Right.
You can't even get an authentic dashiki anymore, because Africa has flooded the market with these fake dashikis to the point where, as I understand it, I think I heard Umar Johnson say that you could go to Africa and buy a dashiki. If you're not careful, you're buying some made in China dashiki. So this is what this capitalist imperialism is at this point now, where the game is so cold, they are making you bake the bread, right? They give you however many slices of that bread that you baked from your flour, from your resources. They give you a slice at a cost. Meanwhile, they own the whole bakery. You see what I'm saying? So it's a cold
absolutely.
game. It's a cold game, man. Continue, Karl.
All right. He also mentions on page 164 about the colonial administration as an economic exploiter. So basically, the administration of the colonies during colonialism and imperialism was set up to exploit the economy. And he mentions that the colonial office had a number of functions: protect national interests, arbitrate conflicts, and to guarantee optimum conditions under which private companies could exploit Africans. That is why colonial governments were repeatedly speaking about the maintenance of law and order, by which they meant the maintenance of conditions most favorable for the exploitation of capitalism and the plunder of Africa. This led to colonial governments to impose taxes. So but these taxes were not used to develop the colonies, and I say develop in quotation marks. As we saw when we read in the, King Leopold's Ghost, how these African people were taxed. And he says it also in here. He says taxes and duties were levied in the 19th century with the aim of allowing the colonial powers to recover the cost of the armed forces which they dispatched to conquer Africa. In effect, therefore, the colonial governments never put a penny into the colonies. All expenses were met by exploiting the labor and natural resources of the continent, and for all practical purposes, the expense of maintaining the colonial government machinery was a form of alienation from the products of African labor.
Cold game.
So it's cold, it's freezing. It says it provided the requisite funds for administering the colony as a field of exploitation. European colonizers ensured that Africans paid for the upkeep of their governors and police who oppressed them and served as watchdogs. So that happens right now.
Right now. Yep.
We pay taxes for the police who oppress us to this day.
Beautiful point. Beautiful. I thought the same thing when I read it. And that's a cold game. I mean, so essentially, the colonizers were just receiving profits. Usually in business, there's expenses and there's profits. There was very little expense. I mean, you were paying for your own oppression.
Yep.
You were paying to put up the governor or ambassador or whatever the name was of those people who came from Europe. You paid to put them up, to keep them nice and nice houses, this, that, and the other. And then you paid for the military occupation. I mean, that's a cold game. And so that cold game, don't think that's in the past like Karl just alluded to. That's happening right now. We pay taxes.
Right now.
We pay taxes that go to pay people like the police. And these scumbags can still murder you right now, brutalize and murder you, not just you, but your children too. And you're paying them to do it. We have to learn. We have to get up from under this, man. This is crazy. Go ahead, Karl, continue.
All right. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit to contributions of colonialism to individual colonizing powers on page 185. And, he talks about how African treasures have been found in the British Museum. So these are sustenance by the colonies that have been given to the colonizers, and how that affects the mentality of the people who are being colonized. Mm-hmm. He mentioned that Africans, on page 187, Africans were fighting Africans to see which European power should rule over them. The Germans and the British only had to provide the officers. So many times they mention how France used African soldiers as powers in their European wars. 25,000 French Africans lost their lives. I say French Africans, the word French is in italics. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned this about military veterans. A number of Africans served as colonial soldiers with pride because they mistakenly hoped that the army would be an avenue for displaying the courage and dignity of Africans, and perhaps in the process even earn the freedom of the continent by making Europeans pleased and grateful. This hope was without foundation from the outset because the colonialists were viciously using African soldiers as pawns to preserve colonialism and capitalism in general. And he mentions John, I'm probably going to say his last name wrong, John Chilewembe, who was an African nationalist in Nyasaland, which is now Malawi. It was then a British colony. At this time, Great Britain was engaged in war with the Germans in World War I. And this African colony fought back. But yet, at the same time, during this war, the British dispatched a division to stop this uprising. Not only that, though, it was a German lieutenant who organized the resistance of the settlers against his bid for freedom. Mm-hmm. So he mentions, even though their countrymen in Europe fought the bloodiest war ever known in Africa, Europeans were instinctively white men first, and German and British second. For John Chilewembe was part of something that, in the end, would swamp all their colonial dreams.
I want you to do me a favor and read that section one more time, because I want people to hear that clearly. Do it one more time for me, please. Okay.
While their countrymen in Europe fought the bloodiest war ever in Africa, Europeans were instinctively white men first, and German and British second. For John Chilewembe was part of something that would, in the end, would swamp all their colonial dreams.
Europeans were white men first, and Germans and whatever else second.
And British second, yep.
You see that, black folks? You see that? You better start to become race first. You see that? Like I always say,
right there.
Europe and Europeans are not a monolith by any means. But when it comes to us, when it comes to non-Europeans, they get on code. They get together. They put aside all that Ukrainian, Russian shit. You call a Ukrainian Russian or a Russian Ukrainian, that person will get upset. But you bring in the African, you enter the African into the room, that Ukrainian and Russian will work together. Trust me. You understand? They're white first. And also in that section, if memory serves me correctly, mm-hmm. When they listed the number of Africans versus Europeans in those militias, and it's overwhelmingly the soldier who's going to get shot at and killed was all African. The guys who were sending the soldiers to get shot at and killed were European. They weren't Europeans fighting with Africans. They were the guys telling the Africans, go in there and, do your best. And this is what happens in the military today. right now, and you know what? Put blackness aside for just a moment. In the military, this is why I never really liked the idea of military. In the military, the guy giving you the orders to storm the beach at Normandy, where those guys already set up, they have the guns set up, they have the ammo set up, and this guy is telling you, when you get off this boat, storm that beach, we need to take that beach. That guy is somewhere in Washington giving that order. And you're losing your life for a guy who's nowhere near the battlefield. Even the closest guy, the colonels and stuff, they're on a ship somewhere looking at what's going on. And I never understood that. I never understood, why would you sign up for that? You know what I mean? Why would you think your life is just for someone else to decide or determine whether you live or die and how badly you die? And so I say this to black folks all the time. Like, I understand they have us in present day, a lot of us in a funny spot economically, and you might feel that going into the military is the better alternative than doing something and going to jail. I get that. But at the same time, that energy that you're going to put in to go fight in the military that doesn't fight for you, you could have spent that time doing something in the community, building a business of your own or something. Like, it doesn't have to be jail or the military. You know what I mean? It doesn't have to be the streets or the military. You know, you can take that energy and build something, because this military just doesn't care about you. And this is your one life you're putting on the line for someone who doesn't care about you. Meanwhile, your community could use that kind of energy to protect it, to build it up, to advance it. You know, Karl?
That's right. You're absolutely right. He mentions how capitalism also, what it evolves into, it's fascism. And I think that we're seeing that in the United States today. He mentions on page 196, fascism is a deformity of capitalism. Mm-hmm. It highlights the imperialist tendency towards domination, which is inherent in capitalism, and it safeguards the principle of private property. At the same time, fascism immeasurably strengthens the institutional racism already bred by capitalism, whether it be against Jews in Hitler's case or against African people, as in the ideology of Portugal's Salazar or the leaders in South Africa, and how it has expanded. Now we see the expansion of more brutal forms of exploitation. Fascism is a monster born of capitalist parents. Fascism came as the end product of centuries of capitalist bestiality, exploitation, domination, and racism, mainly exercised outside of Europe.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that the way that and I don't want to get too far into socialism versus capitalism and everything like that, but it is a growing concern of how the society is shaping up now. And he mentions how in the Second World War that Africa was used to buttress capitalism economically and militarily, and therefore forcing Africa to contribute to its own exploitation. So This is something that we see happening today in the world.
So, in this chapter, was it this chapter or was it the last chapter? Remind me, in this chapter, I believe Walter Rodney talks about economic surpluses in Africa. And
yes, it is.
And how the surpluses were created in Africa, and all of it was sent to Europe. And the thing to be noted is that these economic surpluses, well, two things. It was achieved by, as you mentioned earlier, giving the Africans next to nothing for their labor. And then, on top of that, not even have any of the products of their labor being able to be used by the African. Like you mentioned, a shirt will come back and you couldn't even afford to buy the shirt, right? But then
exactly.
the other thing Walter talks about, which is interesting, he said those surpluses that were created from Africa didn't go to Europe in the form of money in each European's pocket. What they did with that money was invested. So this is where like the capitalist feudalism turns into fascism, right? Because
yeah,
because they were investing that money into like government projects, infrastructure. So it wasn't a case where the average European was making this money, had money appearing in their pockets, but the governments were able to invest in the country and even get interest off the country. So it's like the stock market almost, right? Where they were getting returns on their investment off of money that was off of damn near free labor of Africans, the exploitation of Africans. So again, I have to use that term again, it's a cold game. Because not only, it's like when you hear guys in the streets talking about flipping money, they were flipping money.
Oh, yes.
They were flipping labor into an economic surplus, and then flipping that. Not only was that money going into directly building and this, that, and the other, but the return on it was what really gave them their wealth. The return on those investments from that money out off of the African back is what, really pushed them forward. And in that chapter, and this piqued my interest as a scientist too, Walter Rodney speaks about research. Did you intend to talk about research?
Yes, we can definitely talk about research.
Okay, so I'll just tee it up. But Walter Rodney talks about research in that chapter. And he talks about how because of the African, right, it's not as simple-minded as saying Africans gave Europeans science or something like that. He said, no, it's not like that. But because of the role Africa played in the development of Europe, scientifically speaking, research was no longer just a leisurely thing. So research was no longer the case of forgetting a cheese sandwich outside and discovering penicillin. It now became a part of everyday life, a part of what they did. And they had the money now to allow for that to happen. You see what I'm saying? So they were getting the returns from the investments of African surplus was allowing them, the Europeans now, to expand on research, not making it a leisurely thing anymore, but making it a part of society. And as you know, and as I've talked about in past podcasts, when you can do scientific research, that's how you advance your economy. And that's something that black people need to understand and need to get involved with. So, not to talk your ear out, but there's a part in that book, I learned something. I had heard someone mention it before, but I really was able to read about it. Walter talks about Liberia. And in Liberia, Firestone, the guy who owned Firestone, the same guy whose tires we all buy, they were able to buy these acres of land to get rubber. And I think they paid like 6 cents for an acre of land or something like that.
Yes, it says on page 192, between 1940 and 1965, Firestone took $600 million worth of rubber out of Liberia. And while in return, the Liberian government received $8 million.
Oh, my God. I mean, again, just a cold game, Karl. I mean, just a cold game. And the reason I brought that up was because what Africa meant to Europe scientifically was that you now had the time and the resources to engage in research and scientific discovery, and with competition, which was another byproduct of capitalism, with competition where other companies were coming into the limelight, trying to get ahead. You had to research, right, to make sure that you had better and better products. So it wasn't just now that you took the raw rubber from Africa. You need to be able to refine it on the spot, and then you need to be able to make sure that your rubber was better than your competitor's rubber. So it created a whole industry of scientific discovery and research, which also, as I've mentioned, drives economy. But I don't want to talk your ear off any further, Karl. You continue.
All right. Well, I think, was there anything else you wanted to touch on in Chapter 5 before we move on to Chapter 6?
No, Chapter 5 was probably, now that I think about it, probably my most favorite chapter. I did like 4 bunch. You know what I'm starting to realize is you start to like every chapter more than the last one. Because it gets deeper, and it also gets closer in the timeline to where we are now as you progress.
Yeah.
Karl, let me take a station ID, and on the other side, we will discuss the last chapter and final comments, okay?
Sure thing.
Okay.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions. Black people face one problem: the problem of ignorance. This is why those who opposed us stole us from our parents, disconnected us from our continent, and enforced on us illiteracy. But now the ignorance is self-inflicted. We send our children to their machines. We detach ourselves from our motherland, and we don't read meaningful literature. Consciousness is a series of stages. The sooner we get to one, the sooner we are ready for the higher. The pro-black compendium accelerates the beginner to the advanced and provides for the advanced an unparalleled breadth. This is the sort of book your enemies do not want you to read, but our ancestors would insist you read twice. Peace Seeker, this is Oni from the pro-black perspective, and we need power. Power will not be handed to us. We need to build power. But in order to build power, we need a power blueprint. You need to study the best blueprints available. You have garbage. You have Wilsons. You have Williams. You have mine. Now, you'll have Cooks. Carlos A. Cooks was Garvey's best student, the greatest mind in the world from 1940 to 1966. Yes, the greatest. Yet Whitey doesn't want you to read his blueprint. Cook's blueprint isn't religious. Cook's isn't for integration. Cook's isn't for communism. Cook's isn't even for anti-blacks. Cook's blueprint is for Africa. And Cook's blueprint is the unknown blueprint that was the basis of black power as we know it today. When you say buy black, you're talking about Cooks. When you say black is beautiful, you're talking about cooks. When you say Malcolm got something right, you're talking about cooks. But Cook's blueprint was lost. And Whitey is hiding that blueprint behind a $1,000 paywall. He's hiding solutions from you, telling you you need to take out a small loan to get the information that can liberate you. Whitey does not want you to have solutions to your problems, but you need solutions. You need power. I will give you the Carlos A. Cook's Reader, valued over $1,000 at a 98% discount, $15. Send $15 to cash.me/$ABS only with the subject Carlos and your email address, and I'll send you the ebook. We need power. You need blueprints. Start building today.
Greetings, family. This is Koku, host of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. In case you didn't know, we have an online book club called the Bitter Medicine Book Club. Every month, we will select a book to inspire the Bitter Medicine Podcast listening audience to read along together. At the end of the month, we will have a call-in show and book discussion. This is a great, dynamic way for readers to not only enjoy a book, but also have others to bounce ideas off of. They say if you want to keep anything away from black people, put it in a book. Don't allow this to be true. Head over to bittermedicineblogs.com and subscribe to our newsletter for important updates. Do that today. Join our reading collective today and empower yourselves, your family, and your community. Peace and blessings.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Koku, and I'm joined today by Mr. Karl Hezekiah, who is the moderator of the Bitter Medicine Book Club, and we're discussing our July reading, which was the How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney, and we've been having a lively discussion. Karl, once again, thanks for doing this. Thanks for appearing on the show to discuss this book.
Oh, no problem. Glad to do it.
Sure. And, at the end of the station break, we played the commercial for the book club. And the book for the month of August is The Psychopathic Racial Personality by Dr. Bobby E. Wright. And, we look forward to reading that book as well. But let's continue with our breakdown of the present book. We're now in the last chapter, chapter 6.
So the next chapter, chapter 6, talks about so-called Europe, the benefits of colonialism. And he mentions a quote by George Patmore, who was a West Indian Pan-Africanist.
Yeah.
The black man certainly has had to pay dear for carrying the white man's burden.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a very, to me, this is a little story about myself. When I was a child, I loved to read. My mother always encouraged reading. And one of my favorite books was The Jungle Book. And it was written by Rudyard Kipling, who was a staunch European racist. He was a strong proponent of colonialism. Mm-hmm. I was 7. I didn't know, But I remember reading his poem he wrote about the white man's burden. And how that kind of struck me as a child. I don't know, I kind of felt betrayed because I loved reading the Jungle Book so much, but at the same time, here he is writing about how the white man should go to Europe and civilize the Africans and other brown and dark-skinned people of the world. That just always kind of stuck with me for some reason.
Yeah.
Like I said, I didn't know any better.
Yeah.
But, he talked about the so-called benefits that colonialism had to African people. And in reality, there was none. And he mentions how on page 205, colonial governments is completely false. Colonialism had only one hand, and that was a one-armed bandit. And we mentioned this in the last book, King Leopold's Ghost. What exactly did the Belgians bring to Congo? And they brought nothing.
Yeah.
And how George Washington Williams mentioned how he would go, and there was not a single hospital. There was no type of communications, no railroad. Everything was set up for the production and the theft of rubber and resources from the Congo.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's something definitely that Rodney writes about, how they how much the Europeans claim to have done and how much they in reality they did, which was absolutely nothing. There was no benefit. And he mentions the Portuguese. Again, he says they stand out because they boasted the most and they did the least.
Mm-hmm.
And he says how, they had the lowest rate of literacy in Africa, even though they were supposedly bringing up certain contributions. They weren't bringing anything.
Right.
Other than exploitation. This is something that is often taught, they brought technology. They didn't bring any technology. There was no technology to bring in this situation.
Yeah.
There was nothing but theft that was being brought.
And if I could interject quickly here.
Yes, sir.
One of the things that should be widely known at this point, when African countries started to push for independence from colonial rule, anything
right.
that the colonizers had built in Africa, they destroyed upon leaving it. Whatever they had contributed to any kind of infrastructure, be it a train rail or something like that, they destroyed the shit before they left.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, he mentioned in this, he said that capitalism did bring social services to European workers, firstly as a byproduct of providing such services for the bourgeoisie and middle class, and later as a deliberate act of policy. Nothing remotely happened in Africa. It says the Portuguese boasted that Angola, Guinea, and Mozambique had been in their possession for 500 years. At the end of 500 years of shouldering the white man's burden, the Portuguese had not managed to train a single African doctor in Mozambique,
mm-hmm.
and the life expectancy in each Angola was less than 30 years. So this is something that the Portuguese boasted of their civilizing mission being brought forward into Africa. He says that he mentioned on page 207 there was an epidemic that broke out in the Lupa gold fields in Tanganyika. One should not wonder that they had no facilities, which would have saved some lives, because in the first place they were not being paid enough to eat properly.
Right.
So you have situations where Africans are not even being fed enough, and yet they're dying from diseases, and yet this colonial government doesn't have a hospital.
Right. And it's interesting that you mentioned that, because that reminds me of another aspect of the book, too, in the beginning. In the beginning, Walter Rodney talks about the different aspects of development, and one of the things he mentioned was nutrition. And I found that was interesting that he mentioned protein intake and stuff like that. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
And so he talked about that in terms of development and underdevelopment. And later here now, he's talking about the fact that, to further prove that Europe brought nothing as far as development or anything goes to Africa, that the life expectancy was still poor. People were malnourished and stuff like that. So I found it interesting that how Walter Rodney wrote the book too. He definitely dotted his I's and crossed his T's. So if he mentioned something in the beginning, he tied it up in the end. Anything else from that chapter you want to mention, Karl?
Oh yes. Something he talks about how the Europeans developed. You know, how they mentioned the goods and the development that colonialism brought, and he mentioned how means of communication were not constructed in the colonial period, so the Africans could visit their friends. More importantly, still, they were not laid down to facilitate internal trade in African commodities. There were no roads connecting different colonies in different parts of the same colony in a manner that made sense with regard to Africa's needs and development. All roads and railways led down to the sea. They were built to extract gold or manganese or coffee or cotton. They were built to make business possible for the timber companies, trading companies, agricultural concession firms, and for white settlers. Any catering to African interests was purely coincidental.
Yeah, purely coincidental. So, I think the major part of this chapter is to just show you, the reader, no matter what era that you're reading this book in, whether it was back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, or now, to always remember and understand that the European doesn't give a shit about you. Never have, never will, and don't fall prey to the games, because another thing Walter does in this book is he points out that a lot of the writers who write about Africa are bourgeoisie capitalists themselves. So they're writing to protect their system, right? And so, they will try to make it seem, just like we talked about in King Leopold's Ghost, the benevolent society, and talking about doing all this wonderful stuff when meanwhile you're killing the people and you're exploiting them for what they have. So this is what Rodney did here in this book, is really just a way of showing you how to navigate European lies.
Absolutely. On page 215, he mentions that. He says, one South African saying put forward that the white man has no kin. His kin is money. That is a profound revelation of the difference between the capitalist and pre-capitalist societies. And when capitalists came into contact with the largely communal African societies, they introduced money in relations at the expense of kinship ties.
Yeah. The white man's kin is money.
Yeah, and that's what his family is.
That's a deep statement right there. That's a deep statement. So, as you mentioned earlier in the show, these guys are all about their money, but the only thing they put above that is their hate of your race.
Yes.
So
one of the few things they'll put above the maximization of profit is the ability to hurt black people.
Yes. So when you listen to our last broadcast, what I did, the crossover show with the Pro-Black Perspective podcast with Onitase, one of the things we discussed about LeBron's school, which I thought was a good gesture initially, and then when you peel back the layers, you start to see the problems with it. But one of the problems I have with LeBron's school is the idea that those black children, those underprivileged children, are family with Whitey, right? So black folks have to get off of this thinking that we have family in white folks. We don't. You know what I'm saying? And so we got to come off of that kind of stuff. But Karl, what else you want to say from this chapter?
He mentions how African exploitation, even if it was supposed to have brought colonial advancement, Africans would have been better off without it.
Yeah.
Because it says industrialization does not only mean factories. Agriculture itself has been industrialized by the extensive application of scientific principles to irrigation, fertilizers, tools, and crops. The decisive failure of colonialism in Africa was its failure to change the technology of agricultural production. So that's something else, that capitalism could revolutionize agriculture in Europe, but yet it could not do the same towards that of Africa. And he mentions on page 219, white racist notions are so deeply rooted within capitalist society that the failure of African agriculture to advance was put down to the inherent inferiority of the African. it would be much truer to say that it was due to the white intruders, although the basic explanation is not to be found in the personal ill will of the colonialists or in their racial origin, but rather in the organized viciousness of the capitalist colonialist system.
And we see that today still. This is what white folks do today. They talk about black culture as the problem, right?
Right.
Black culture is not the problem. It's black folks being in proximity to white folks that's the problem. You know what I mean? But go on.
Yes, and also how their exploitation is facilitated in these societies. This is something we also talked about in the last book on page 221. Side by side with the ill-founded claims about socio-economic modernization went the claims by colonial apologists that European rule brought political uplift and emancipation. One of the long-standing arguments in this connection is that Africa was in chaos in the 19th century and that the tribes were killing each other left and right. Consequently, Africa was saved by Livingstone and Stanley. I can't say this without laughing. For the most part, such wild statements have no place in the works of present generation European scholars of Africa, since they are known to have no resemblance to reality. So it's always telling to me how they try to flip. Oh, you guys are just killing each other. We had to come in and stop you.
Yeah.
It's hilarious to me.
By killing more of you. You know what I'm saying? That's the part they tend to leave out. You guys were killing each other. We came in to stop you by killing a bunch of you. So, it's just nonsense. It's just nonsense. And the key.
But yet, this is the truth we believe, though.
This is what we believe, and this is why we have to have these reading groups. We have people like scholars like this who can break it down and present to you the facts. White lies has a lot of black people messed up out here right now.
Yes, they do.
Yes,
they do. And in the next book we're talking about, he refers to it as a condition he refers to. Dr. Bobby E. Wright calls it menticide.
Yes.
Which means the destruction of a group's mind. And that is what we see today. I don't want to give any spoilers for those people who are getting ready for the next book, but that would be touched more on detail, the aspect of menticide.
Yes. And so, on this show, we try to not just give facts, but to give some solutions as well. Let's talk about some solutions that come from this book. I think that's like the major solution is stop listening to what they tell you. Look it up yourself. Listen to your own people tell the story. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Because they anything they do, they're going to paint it in the whitest light possible.
Right. Right. And I wonder, one other solution is that, like you mentioned in the beginning, Walter Rodney was a socialist. He believed that the economic system of capitalism is geared toward profit, whereas he felt that more economic systems that may have been geared more toward African communalism, which is what originally was started, could have been more better for African people because it put the control over the resources within the hands of the people. Mm-hmm. I'm not, like you said, we're not here to debate the merits of capitalism or socialism, mm-hmm. but African people do need control over their own resources in order to further develop their communities, and not just on the African continent, but within our own communities. We have internal markets that we as African people do not have control over. You have the hair care industry, where black people are the majority of the ones who buy hair care products, but yet we don't control those stores.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
So it's about control over our resources, our internal markets, and not have those things taken by other groups, which mm-hmm. serves to further underdevelop us.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. This concept is kind of common sense, but when you've been fed the lies for so long, there are aspects of it that kind of come across as a revelation. So there's aspects of this book that, although common sense is like a revelation. You know, in truth, if I leave you with nothing, just a roll of string, a stick of chewing gum, and some popsicle sticks, you can't build a skyscraper. You know what I'm saying? If I leave you with just that, you can't build a skyscraper. You can't make a car. You can't do this and the, you know, this, that, and the other. So we have to understand that when someone takes all that stuff from you, it's gonna stunt. It's gonna stunt your growth and development. And we as a people have been stunted. Now, at the same time, here's the thing that I want the listeners to take away from this too. To show how brilliant we are, we still persevere. We've still made contributions to science. We've still made contributions to technology and other aspects of life. You see what I'm saying? So imagine if we didn't have that intervention and we were allowed to be unified, right? And allowed to develop naturally. Imagine what we would have done. This is why I say that imagery or the ideal that a Wakanda in the Black Panther film and stuff and the comic book stands for, we could have had that. I truly believe we could have had that because we still persevered. Think about it in slavery. A lot of inventions that came about during the time of slavery and Jim Crow, black people were creating those things, but we did not have the access to patent those things directly. So the so-called master, they got to patent those things. You know, but it's still our ingenuity. It's still our contributions. Had you allowed those people to remain in their homeland, in their communities for generations, imagine what Africa could have been. You see what I'm saying? Exactly.
And that's so funny that you mentioned that, because me being a longtime comic book fan, that's something that really I was very happy to see that in the movie, how they mentioned that Wakanda's development came as a result of not being conquered.
Yes.
Because they were able to develop alongside their own lines according to their culture and their society. Mm-hmm. And it produced the most advanced society on Earth.
On Earth.
Because of that.
Yeah. And so this is why when people knock things like, you know, Black Panther movie and stuff like that, I had to look at you kind of sideways a little bit. Yeah, I of course, Disney is making money off of it. Of course, it was some white guys who developed the concept, but it's evolved over time to include a more Africanist view, right? And I believe that it has captured the idea, and I think the film, like you just said, captured the idea that, hey, if you had left Africans alone, if Africans didn't come into contact with these people, we would be advanced too.
Yes, absolutely. And, you know, Dr. Rodney does touch on this as well in this book also. You know, he says that, you know, during the period of colonial trade, you know, seeing as how the development of Africans was taken so far off course as far as the, you know, reduction in population, the constant exploitation and brutality, that we don't know where the African society would have developed to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we don't know. So what we have to do is kind of try to get that, try to get the train back on the rails, so to speak, you know. We have to we have to get back on course. And I think in some aspects we have, but, you know, as long as we are not black first, you know, race first, like these white folks are, we won't get where we need to be. At the end of the day, forget about who was from Africa, what part of Africa. Forget about who's from the Caribbean, which island. Forget about who's from America, which state. Who's from South America, which country. You know, be black first.
Yes. Dr. John Henry Clark said that the only difference between a black American, a Jamaican, or a Trinidadian is a boat stop. We're focused on where the slave ship dropped us off at and not where the slave ship picked us up from.
Oh, man, I love that quote. We're focused on where the ship stopped at, not where it came from. And where it came from
Yes.
was greatness until it was interrupted by white people. And that's just the truth of the matter.
They didn't pick up slaves in Africa. They didn't pick up slaves. They picked up Africans and enslaved them. They were never slaves in Africa. They were forced into bondage.
Yeah. And they picked up people who would have been doctors, who would have been governors, who would have been scientists, they picked up potential, raw African potential. And we got to recognize that, man. And we got to silence these folks who have an anti-African narrative. We got to silence these Negroes too.
Well, you know what? And Dr. Rodney says on page 225, to be colonized is to be removed from history, except in the most passive sense. So the African countries that were colonized, their side of the story is not being told. You know, we mentioned in the last book how, he mentioned how King Alfonso of the Congo was a rare African voice during this period of history.
Yeah.
Africans are not being able to tell their side of the story. Anyone who has a black person, especially in America, who has an anti-African bias is ignorant of their history.
Mm-hmm.
And it's amazing to me. There's some Europeans who do not like each other. Like we mentioned before, in Malawi, the uprising with John Chilewembe.
Yeah.
Great Britain and Germany were at war with one another.
Yep.
And yet they were able to put aside their differences to accomplish their goals.
Yep.
Black people in America can't endure name calling from Africans, but yet we can endure fire hoses, dogs, our children being killed in order to be close to Europeans. There's something wrong with that picture.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy. And
but there's something wrong with that.
Yeah, we have to shake that off now, man. But Karl, is there any last thoughts you want to give on this book?
I think this book here is definitely should be read to counter some of the European propaganda that we have experienced, and we all experience on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm.
So it does help create a sense of pride in our history, but I don't want it just to be from a prideful standpoint. It's one thing to put dashikis in the African medallions, and that's all well and good. But then you have to take this history and look at it from a sober analysis and understand what went wrong and the ways to correct the problems.
Yes. Beautifully said. Karl, I want to thank you for appearing on the show today. For those listening, I'm sure if you read the book, there's things that we probably didn't touch on because it's that kind of book. There's so much things being expressed in this work that we would have to be here for 24 hours to break down everything. But the discussion doesn't have to end here. Join us in the comment section and point out things that we may have missed, things that we jumped over, things that we didn't get as deep as we could have. And let's continue the conversation there. Karl, as always, I want to thank you, and I'm looking forward to our conversation at the end of this month for the book that we're reading this month. Karl, what made you choose the August reading?
Well, what made me choose this? This is a random incident. There was another, as usual, a young man got killed by law enforcement, shot in the back several times. And his mother or some people were screaming, why does this happen? Why does this keep going on? It doesn't make any sense. And when she said that, I thought of this book by Bobby E. Wright. He talks about how the Europeans' relationship with black people is that of the psychopath. And I think once we understand that, we can stop asking why, and then we can start asking, what can we do about this?
That's a good point. That's an excellent point. So, guys, this has been another episode of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Karl, is there anything you want to shout out, social media, any projects, anything like that?
Well, I'm behind on the blog, but I'll be there. I'll have the blogs up for last month and for this month's book, hopefully all at one time. So be sure to check those out once they're posted.
Once again, guys, thanks for listening. This has been another episode of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Peace.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Koku. If you like what you just heard, we hope you pass along our web address, bittermedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Bitter Medicine Show, Twitter, Bitter Meds, Tumblr, Bitter Meds, Instagram, Bitter Medicine.